The static crackled through Thomas Beckett's headphones like winter ice breaking underfoot. March 1943, and the North Atlantic was doing what it always did, trying to kill everyone on it. HMS Wanderer, a Flower-class corvette that rolled in seas calmer than this, pitched violently as another wave slammed against her hull. Beckett's fingers hovered over the transmitter key, trembling not from cold, but from what he was about to do. Below decks, 147 merchant seamen were dying in the freezing water, their ship torn open by torpedoes. Around him, the convoy commodore's strict orders echoed in his mind: radio silence at all costs. Break silence, and you give away the convoy's position to every U-boat within 200 miles. But Beckett had heard something in the static, a pattern, a rhythm that shouldn't exist in the chaos of a wolf-pack attack. His hand moved to the key. One tap would violate every protocol in the Royal Navy's Convoy Defense Manual. One tap might save 6,000 tons of steel and grain headed for a starving Britain. One tap might also doom them all. He pressed down. Thomas Beckett hadn't planned on being the man who would rewrite naval doctrine. 26 years old, born in the Suffolk countryside to a postal clerk and a schoolteacher, he'd grown up listening to the world through his father's amateur radio set. While other boys kicked footballs through village lanes, young Thomas sat in the cramped attic space his father called a wireless room, learning Morse code by transcribing weather reports and ship movements. He had a gift for it, not just the mechanical skill of translating dots and dashes, but something more intuitive. He heard patterns where others heard noise. He found meaning in silence. His teachers said he had a mathematical mind, the kind that could spot a missing number in a sequence or predict the next move in a chess game 3 turns ahead. But mathematics required university, and university required money the Becketts didn't have. So when war came in 1939, Thomas joined the Royal Navy as a telegraphist, a choice that surprised no one who knew him. The Navy needed men who could listen, and Thomas Beckett had spent his whole life learning how by 1943 he'd survived 2 years of convoy duty, which made him a veteran by North Atlantic standards. He'd watched ships die, flaming orange eruptions against black water, men screaming as fuel oil ignited around them, the terrible moment when a freighter's bow lifted skyward before sliding beneath the waves. He'd learned to sleep through depth charge explosions and eat cold stew while the corvette corkscrewed through 40-foot seas. More importantly, he'd learned to listen not just to what was being transmitted, but to what wasn't. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in March 1943, a battle Britain was losing. German U-boats operated in coordinated groups called wolf packs, brutal tactic in the German doctrine developed by Admiral Karl Dönitz. The strategy was devastatingly effective. Scout submarines spread across the convoy routes would locate Allied merchant ships, then radio their positions to other boats. 20, 30, sometimes 40 U-boats would converge on a single convoy, attacking from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts. In the first 3 months of 1943 alone, German submarines had sunk over 1 million tons of Allied shipping. The Allies fought back with every tool they had. Destroyers and corvettes formed protective screens around convoys. RAF Coastal Command flew long-range patrols. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked around the clock to decrypt German naval signals. But the U-boats had one critical advantage. They could coordinate their attacks by radio, while Allied convoy doctrine demanded strict radio silence. Their transmitting ship was a beacon, a target painted in electromagnetic waves that German direction-finding equipment could track across hundreds of miles of ocean. Every Allied radioman knew the rules. Silent running until safely in port. No exceptions. The Germans were listening, always listening, with shore stations in occupied France and Norway triangulating every careless transmission. Break silence, and you might as well fire a flare into the night sky. Convoy HX-231 had sailed from New York on March 20, 1943, 41 merchant ships carrying tanks, aircraft, food and fuel oil. The escort group, designated B-5, consisted of HMS Wanderer and 5 other corvettes plus 2 destroyers. Not enough ships to protect 41 targets spread across 10 square miles of ocean, but there weren't enough escorts to go around. Never were. They'd made it 1,200 miles into the crossing when the wolf pack found them. Not by chance. German B-Dienst intelligence had broken enough of the British convoy codes to predict routes and positions. U-436 made first contact on March 28th, shadowing the convoy from beyond visual range, radioing position updates to other boats. By nightfall on the 29th, 17 U-boats were converging. Beckett had been on watch when the first ship died. SS Leadgate, a 5,000-ton freighter carrying steel and lumber, took a G7E torpedo amidships at 2140 hours. The explosion was a dull crump that traveled through water and hull, felt more than heard. Then the screaming started on the radio frequencies. Men trapped below decks, the ship settling fast. Wanderer's Captain Commander James Henderson gave the order Beckett hated most. Maintain station, maintain silence, do not break formation. Rescue ships would collect survivors later. If any survived the 20 minutes a man lasted in 38-degree water. 2 more ships went down in the next hour. The Wolfpack was using classic tactics, submerged attacks from within the convoy columns, firing from point-blank range where escorts couldn't maneuver, then diving deep while the corvettes chased false contacts. Beckett sat in his radio cubicle, listening to the convoy frequency, hearing nothing but the prearranged signals indicating course changes. No one calling for help, no one giving positions. Silence while men drowned. The fourth attack came at 02:30 on March 30th. SS Corinthia, a tanker carrying aviation fuel. The torpedo hit forward, and the ship went up like a torch. 14,000 tons of steel turned into a floating inferno that illuminated the entire convoy. Beckett could see it through the porthole beside his station, a pillar of fire climbing 200 feet into the night sky. In that light, the U-boats would be able to see every ship's silhouette, every escape route, every blind spot in the escort screen. That's when he heard it. A transmission on 600 kilocycles, a frequency the Germans used for U-boat coordination. Short staccato bursts, Morse code, but something was wrong with the rhythm. Too regular, too precise. Then another transmission on a slightly different frequency, overlapping the first, then a third. Beckett grabbed a pencil and started transcribing. The messages were in German naval code, which he couldn't read, but that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the timing between transmissions, the intervals measured in seconds. 3 boats transmitting in sequence, 5 seconds apart, then 7, then 5 again. A pattern. He pulled out his navigation chart and calculated. If those boats were using direction finding to locate the convoy, and if they were transmitting from different positions, the timing could reveal their geometry. Trigonometry, the kind of problem his old mathematics teacher would have appreciated. 3 points of a triangle, with the convoy at its center. Beckett sketched it quickly. If U-boat Alpha transmitted at bearing 240 degrees, and Bravo at 310, and Charlie at 20, they were surrounding the convoy in a loose arc, spacing themselves roughly 20 miles apart. But there was something else. The intervals weren't quite consistent. The 5-second gaps varied by tenths of a second, 4.8, 5.2, 4.9. To most operators, that would be meaningless noise, operator error, or atmospheric distortion. To Beckett, it was information. Those variations meant the boats were moving, changing position relative to each other, and if they were moving in a coordinated pattern, that meant they were herding the convoy. Wolfpack doctrine called for submarines to position themselves ahead of a convoy's projected course, then wait for the targets to steam into the ambush. But these boats were doing something different. They were pushing the convoy eastward, toward a concentration point. Somewhere ahead, more U-boats were waiting. Beckett stared at his calculations. If he was right, the convoy was steaming directly into a trap that would be sprung in roughly 4 hours. If he was wrong, he was seeing patterns in random noise, the kind of paranoid fantasy that exhaustion and fear could create. Commander Henderson needed to know. But regulations were absolute. Radiomen did not interpret intelligence, they transcribed it. Tactical decisions belonged to officers, not to a telegraphist from Suffolk who liked numbers. Besides, what could Henderson do with this information? Change course? That required breaking radio silence to notify the other escorts and the convoy commodore. And changing course based on one radioman's hunch would be career suicide if it proved wrong. Beckett made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed in any other circumstance. He left his post and climbed to the bridge. Henderson was a career officer, 43 years old, with a reputation for following regulations with religious precision. When Beckett appeared on the bridge, Radiomen didn't appear on the bridge during action. Henderson's expression could have frozen the Atlantic solid. This had better be critical, Beckett. It took 2 minutes for Beckett to explain what he'd heard. Henderson listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When Beckett finished, the commander stared at the navigation table for 30 seconds that felt like hours. "You're asking me to trust that 3 variations in Morse timing, measured in tenths of a second, prove 18 U-boats are executing a coordinated ambush." Henderson's voice was flat. "And to act on that intelligence by breaking radio silence?" "Yes, sir. If you're wrong, we lead the entire wolf pack directly to this convoy. Every U-boat within 200 miles will converge on our transmission." "If I'm right, sir, they're already converging. We're sailing into them." Henderson looked out at the burning tanker, still lighting up the night. 4 ships down, 37 to go. At this rate, the convoy would be decimated before reaching the air gap, that horrible 1,000-mile stretch in mid-Atlantic where no land-based aircraft could provide cover. "How certain are you?" Beckett thought about lying, about inflating his confidence to sound more convincing. But Henderson had asked the right question and deserved an honest answer. 70%, sir." Henderson nodded slowly. "Return to your station, Beckett. Maintain listening watch." Beckett's stomach dropped. He saluted and turned to leave, certain he'd just watched the convoy's death warrant being signed. "Beckett." Henderson's voice stopped him at the bridge ladder. "When I give the order, you'll transmit on the emergency frequency. Full position, report course and speed. You'll repeat it 3 times to ensure every U-boat within range hears it clearly." "Sir, if we're going to break silence, we'll do it properly. Make them think we're panicking." Henderson smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "And then we'll give them something to panic about." 20 minutes later, Beckett's finger hit the transmitter key. The message went out in clear language, no code. "HX-231 under heavy attack. Position 52° A15 and 35°40 W. Course 075, speed 8 knots. Request immediate air support." He repeated it 3 times, exactly as ordered, then waited. Around the convoy, the other escorts would be hearing that transmission, their captains furious at Wanderer's breach of protocol. The convoy commodore would be composing a scathing report. And every U-boat in the North Atlantic would be calculating intercept courses. Henderson's next order came through the voice tube. "Hard to port. Flank speed. Fire star shells on bearing 240. Wanderer heeled violently as her rudder bit, the corvette's single screw thrashing water as she accelerated to her maximum 14 knots. Behind them, the convoy continued on its original course. The other escorts, confused but trained to maintain formation, stayed with the merchant ships. The star shells burst overhead at 500 feet, dangling beneath parachutes, casting a harsh white light across the ocean. And there, caught on the surface recharging batteries, was U-436. The submarine crash-dived immediately, but 14 knots was faster than most U-boats could manage submerged. Wanderer raced toward the swirl of water marking the dive point, her depth charges already set. Henderson called the attack personally, his voice crisp over the intercom. "Fire pattern Delta. Shallow settings. He can't be deeper than 60 feet yet." 10 depth charges rolled off Wanderer's stern and throwers in the classic pattern, erupting in columns of white water that lifted the corvette's stern clear of the sea. Beckett, back in his radio cubicle, felt the hull shudder with each detonation. Then, through his headphones, he heard something that made him pull them off in shock. Transmissions, multiple transmissions, all on U-boat frequencies, all transmitting at once. Not coordinated signals, these were panicked, overlapping, stepping on each other in the electromagnetic spectrum. The Wolfpack was reacting to Wanderer's attack, and in their haste to coordinate a response, they were giving away every position. Beckett started plotting. Bearing 240, bearing 310, bearing 020, his original triangle, but also bearing 165, bearing 185, bearing 275, 6-boat 7-8, all transmitting, all adjusting their positions in response to the panicking convoy's distress call. He grabbed the voice tube. "Bridge, multiple contacts transmitting, I have bearings." Henderson's voice cut him off. "Mark them on the plot and bring it up. Now." What happened over the next 6 hours became a textbook example of how doctrine evolves through desperate improvisation. Henderson took Beckett's bearing plot and radioed it, violating silence again, to the other escorts. But he didn't broadcast on the convoy frequency. He used the German U-boat coordination frequency, transmitting false position reports in broken German that suggested Wanderer was a U-boat that had surfaced inside the convoy screen and was under attack. The confusion was total. German submarines trying to coordinate their assault found their radio frequencies flooded with contradictory information. Some boats dove to avoid what they thought was a friendly fire incident. Others surfaced to challenge what they believed were false reports. And every time they transmitted, Beckett plotted their positions. The escort group, understanding Henderson's strategy now, began hunting with precision instead of desperation. HMS Clematis caught U-436 trying to reposition, sinking her with a deliberate depth charge attack. HMS Snowflake damaged U-229 badly enough that she had to break off and head for France. One by one, the Wolfpack members found themselves detected, hunted, and forced to dive deep and run silent. Exactly what they'd been doing to the convoys for 3 years. By dawn on March 31st, the attack was over. The convoy had lost 4 ships, terrible but far less than the catastrophic losses typical of Wolfpack engagements. The U-boats broke off. Their coordinated assault dissolved into individual retreats. Beckett, exhausted, sat in his radio cubicle listening to the silence that meant survival. The official report, filed by Convoy HX-231's senior escort officer, noted unconventional use of radio intelligence and counter-communications tactics by HMS Wanderer. That bland language concealed a revolution. Beckett's technique, using enemy transmissions to plot positions, then deliberately flooding their frequencies with false information, became standard practice within months. The Admiralty called it radio warfare. The men who practiced it called it Beckett's gambit. Commander Henderson received a Distinguished Service Order. Thomas Beckett received a Distinguished Service Medal and a promotion to Petty Officer. More importantly, he was transferred to the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, where his pattern recognition skills were applied to analyzing the entire U-boat fleet's communications. The insights he provided helped turn the Battle of the Atlantic decisively in Britain's favor by mid-1943. But numbers don't capture what happened that night. The official statistics say Convoy HX-231 lost 4 ships instead of a projected 15. They say the Wolfpack was dispersed with 1 confirmed kill and 2 damaged boats. They don't mention the 141 merchant seamen who made it to lifeboats because their ships stayed afloat. They don't count the RAF pilot who didn't die when the aircraft fuel he was supposed to ferry actually arrived in Britain. They can't measure the ripple effects of one man deciding that the rules, sacred as they were, mattered less than the pattern he'd recognized in static. Thomas Beckett survived the war. He returned to Suffolk in 1946, married a teacher from the neighboring village, and worked for the post office installing telephone lines. He rarely talked about the war, even when other veterans gathered at the pub to share stories. When pressed, he would say only that he'd been a radio man, nothing special. In 1983, 40 years after that March night, a naval historian researching convoy tactics tracked Beckett down. By then he was 76, retired, spending his days in a garden shed that looked remarkably like his father's old wireless room. The historian wanted to know how he'd known to break silence, whether it was training or intuition or luck. Beckett thought about it for a long time before answering. "I think," he said finally, "it was about listening to what wasn't being said. The Germans were so confident in their tactics that they'd become predictable. Patterns repeat, if you know how to listen for them. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust what you hear, even when it contradicts everything you've been taught." The historian asked if he'd been frightened that night, making a decision that could have destroyed his career and killed hundreds of men. Terrified, Beckett admitted, but more frightened of staying silent when silence would kill people. Rules exist for good reasons, but they're not sacred. Lives are sacred. The trick is knowing when the rule serves the life and when it doesn't. The tactical innovation Beckett pioneered that night became a cornerstone of modern naval warfare. Every submarine service now trains operators to minimize transmissions, knowing that electromagnetic emissions can be as revealing as a periscope wake. Every surface navy teaches radio warfare, using communications not just for coordination, but as a weapon. The principle that information is a battlefield, and that patterns in noise can reveal intentions, shapes everything from signals intelligence to cybersecurity. But perhaps the deeper lesson is about the space between doctrine and wisdom, between following orders and thinking clearly under pressure. Thomas Becket didn't break radio silence because he was rebellious or reckless. He did it because he'd spent his life learning to recognize patterns, and in that recognition, he saw a truth more important than the rule against transmitting. He understood that doctrine exists to protect lives, and when the doctrine itself endangers those lives, it must adapt. The British Admiralty formally changed convoy communications procedures in August 1943, incorporating active radio intelligence into standard tactics. They never credited a telegraphist from Suffolk by name in the official doctrine manuals. But among the radio men who served in the North Atlantic, the men who listened to the ocean speak in dots and dashes, Thomas Becket's name was spoken with something close to reverence. He was the man who heard what others missed, who trusted mathematics over fear, and who understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay silent when the pattern demands you speak. In the end, that's what saves lives, not following rules blindly, not breaking them carelessly, but understanding them deeply enough to know when they serve their purpose and when they don't. On a freezing March night in 1943, one radioman understood that distinction. And because he did, 6,000 tons of steel and grain reached Britain, and 141 men went home who otherwise wouldn't have. And the pattern shifted just slightly toward the side that learned to listen better than it learned to fear.